how did you first get interested into architecture? When was the first time you knew this was your thing?
I love that question. It's actually a question I ask when I interview someone, a candidate, because I do think it's a fascinating question. I do see a lot of commonality, the answers I get, starting with, and this is almost a checklist. I played with Legos when I was a child. I drew house plans when I was a child. And for me, it's check. I was all about Legos, and my mom still has the house plans that I drew when I was about 5 years old, which I think is hilarious because what kind of 5-year-old draws house plans? But, maybe those are foundational answers. But the real answer, that the first time that I had the conscious thought, I think I want to be an architect, was when I was 15 and a half years old. Mm-hmm. And our family took a vacation to Chicago. So I grew up in Oklahoma in a small town, and Oklahoma is very rural overall. We took a trip to Chicago, and we're walking down the street, and I'm just, my head is tilting. I'm just going back and forth, and I'm looking at all of these amazing skyscrapers and all this great architecture. And I said, this is what I want to do. This is what I think I need to be when I grow up. Look at all of these amazing things around us. People did that. Architects designed that. That's what I want to do. I remember it because it was a very distinct thought. I remember it like it was yesterday. I just sort of had that feeling, that thing in your gut that says, this is it. This is what I want to do.
That's amazing. And Dwayne, so could you tell us a little about your early professional journey in terms of you graduate out of architecture school? Yeah. What was that journey like to getting your first job?
Wow. So when I graduated architecture school on my journey to my first job, it wasn't a straightforward process. I graduated at a time where the economy was slightly weaker. It wasn't really a recession or anything like that, but it was a weaker economy. Mm-hmm. And like I said, I grew up in a small town. I didn't have a lot of connections. My parents were blue collar, and I didn't really have a lot of entry points into the profession. So through some professors, I got some interviews at some unusual places, and I ended up taking a position for the Federal Aviation Administration in Oklahoma City as a contract employee through Lockheed Martin. So my first job as an architect was with Lockheed Martin. Okay. And for the FAA, and when I tell that story, people are like, what? What do you even do? Well, it turns out that there's a rather large campus in Oklahoma City just devoted to the FAA, and there's something like 60 buildings on that campus. And they range from like medical buildings to storage and warehouse buildings to hangars and office buildings. And they have an entire department full of architects, engineers, and construction contract surveyors who manage those buildings, and they manage any architects that design other projects that go onto that campus or renovations that go onto this campus. So it's actually a very fascinating place with some very sensitive buildings that even I couldn't access. Mm-hmm. That has some interesting history to it from our space program. And currently still is one of or the only place where they train aircraft or air tower controllers. Very interesting place, a very odd and interesting place to start a career. So I started there, and from there, now building connections in the industry, moved on to a more traditional architecture firm after that, where largely I designed, I did do a student union, but I also did banks, a lot of banks, okay. Branch banks, which is, again, something you're like, okay, that's interesting. But from there, I made other connections, and that's where I made my entry into healthcare architecture, which is where I've spent my career since. So since about 2006, I've done only healthcare architecture. And as of a couple of years ago, as a facet of healthcare architecture, started doing security design through environmental design, and got to actually go back and use some of the skill sets I learned when I was designing banks something I thought would be completely unrelated to healthcare, and now is something that is relevant to what I do, and how you think about how the built environment can literally shape how people feel about security, or how security can actually be made more effective through the design of the built environment. And in healthcare, because this is all I do, it is doubly important because the healthcare environment is the most violent workplace in America, according to OSHA. And there's more. Yeah, I know, it's interesting. And there's a lot of news stories that if you look, there's a lot of things that happen in a healthcare environment. So as a way to address that, as a piece of architecture, it's something that I think is largely ignored or just unknown, or maybe a lot of architects don't even know that we have the ability to affect that through the built environment. So I started going down that path and have devoted the last few years to making that a stronger part of our practice, and working with a lot of our clients, our existing clients, in all of these different healthcare environments across a multi-state region to be able to start to make their spaces safer.
So those are some very interesting points you brought about, Dwayne. With regards to that, Dwayne, again, it's probably something you did touch upon. So I was going to come into, you hold a certification from National Institute of Crime Prevention, something you got in recently. I know you just spoke about that on the lines of
Sure.
it. What I want to ask you about that is, how do you see that contributing to healthcare design industry? That's an insight you just kind of spoke upon, but it's very fascinating to me how those two things tie together.
Absolutely. Let's dig into that a little more specifically. So just to kind of repeat the question, how does security design tie into healthcare? And I think it very clearly does, because when any user of any building goes anywhere, they need to feel a sense of safety and security. And the analogy I like to use is, imagine going to the airport in 1980 or 1990, or whenever, 1995, if people were around back then. There was a stark lack of security. We didn't know any different. It was just how it was. If you fast forward to today, and you have that same level of security in airports, people would be uncomfortable. As much as the security can sometimes be a barrier, takes time, can kind of be a pain in the neck to take your shoes off, people want the security there. People want to feel safe. And really, architecture is no different, and healthcare is no different. When you go to a healthcare environment, you want to have a sense of health and healing. You're there because something's not right. Depending on the specific thing you're there for, it may be the worst day of your life. It may be the worst time your family's ever been through. The last thing you want to think about is, do I feel safe here? And there are hospitals and healthcare environments everywhere. Sometimes they're in areas that are not particularly safe. There's a lot of crime. So being able to provide an environment that people feel safe and secure in actually does enhance the hospital's ability to provide a safe and secure environment. I think it does go hand in hand. I think NICP is a great, National Institute of Crime Prevention is a great organization that is bringing this to the forefront, but it really isn't a new concept. It started in, I believe it was the 70s with Jane Jacobs, who wrote Eyes on the Street. And then from there started to become something that was now known as CPTED, which is Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. Law enforcement has strongly adopted this, believe it or not, because there are a lot of principles in this that, again, psychologically help people to feel safe and secure. And that's an important aspect of policing and crime prevention. If you can prevent crime, it's better than having to react to crime. So it's a very natural extension, in my opinion, to put that in the world of architecture. I think for me, I saw the connection to healthcare because I just do healthcare all the time. And I talk to a lot of clients and owners who deal with this on a daily basis. the public at large doesn't really know everything that goes on in a hospital because, there's, like anybody else, there's a public image they have to maintain to make sure people feel like they can be at that place. And that is very important. People need to feel secure. But a lot of people aren't happy with that. They want people to actually be secure. So they're taking this extra step. And what really pushed us towards that is we had one client in particular who is a vice president of security for a large regional system. And he said, this is what I do. This is what I deal with. I'm surprised there's not architects out there doing this. And he and I got to talking, and that's where the banking background came up. And he's like, so you did think about this with banking? Yeah, sure did. How far away is the door from the teller? How high is the teller stand? Can the teller hide behind that stand? So it's just, it's an architectural way of thinking, but it's to do a specific thing for security. It's not just biometrics or card readers or technology or security guards. It's the actual built environment. And so through this conversation, he said, I just don't see a lot of architects out there doing this, but it is something we absolutely need in healthcare. So I started doing the research, and I started finding out, actually, this is an environment that can benefit from something like this. This is this quiet little thing that's happening under the surface that not that many people know about. And we are in a great position to make things better, to make this environment safer, to allow people to go to the hospital or to a healthcare environment without having to worry about being safe and just focus on healing. Right? I don't want someone to have to go to anything that I've been involved with and feel unsafe. So you want to take that off the table. They need to feel safe first, and then they can go and focus on what they need to focus on. So it's a really broad and fascinating segment that we're dealing with that has real world implications, I think, on how people's experiences are in a healthcare environment.
That's very interesting, Dwayne. In fact, I think another question from this that I would have in mind is, I'm kind of just thinking aloud, like a couple of months ago, I think I live in Ottawa. I visited a hospital there, especially given post-pandemic with mental health issues are on the rise. And there are patients as well who are going to come in. Do you see that kind of increasing the need for what you're talking about? Like, I didn't know something like this exists either. And the fact that you bring light to it makes so much sense now.
For behavioral health, I think behavioral health is a very special piece of healthcare, and we do a fair amount of behavioral health as well. And inherent to behavioral health is providing a secure environment. And for a lot of the things we're doing there is really for the caregiver as well as the patient, because the caregiver is in an environment that has an element of danger. There's if you're in this industry for very long, or if you've done much behavioral health, there's always a horror story. There's always someone who has a mental break or a medication error or something that went wrong and created a dangerous environment. So a lot of the codes and regulations around behavioral health already deal with a certain element of health and safety and security in that environment. Things like the materials you use, or little details like anti-pick caulk or zones, what needs to be treated based on what zone they're in, how much observation does a patient have here versus here. Their room, they have less observation than the common room. And then there's some aspects that their patients don't go at all. So each of these areas has sort of a different treatment. That's already built into behavioral health. But similarly, there's ways to treat behavioral health to provide that safe environment without it feeling like an institution. And that is a big piece of what we strive to do. There's always the realities of a project. It's always budget driven and things like that. But there's a lot of little things that you can do to try to, again, psychologically help people feel safe and put them in a healing environment that still provides for the safety of the staff and the other users. So I do think behavioral health is a very interesting, specific category of healthcare that we do, that has a lot of aspects of safety and security built in that most architects who do behavioral health are probably aware of. But I think taking it to that next level and thinking of the overall safety, security, and how people perceive space and safety and security, the psychological perception of safety and security, I think that's the next aspect of it that we're folding in based on some of the security thinking.
This is all very fascinating, Dwayne. So, I mean, the fact that you're kind of balancing act between making people feel safe, then there is security to it, which can even be contradictory at times.
Sure.
To that hat, like how do you, I know you have an expertise in sustainable design as well. What kind of strategies do you implement to promote sustainability within this space again? Could you speak to that, Dwayne, within the healthcare industry, given there are just so many variables and so many things to look into?
Yeah, sustainability is one of those things that, I'm forgetting exactly when it became a popular thing. It became in vogue for a long time to do LEED and things like that. And I don't see that as much anymore. I don't see that specific program as much anymore. It's definitely still there. It's definitely still important. But the most important thing it did was raise awareness to the fact that we have a lot of control over environmental factors just by how we design buildings. What I would say is, I think the industry has taken a lot of those lessons and has made it the default. So I don't think it's an either or situation now. I think many architects are already just designing more responsible buildings, better envelope design, better efficiency equipment on the HVAC. We're designing a hospital right now where we're looking at the solar angles and the wind angles, and trying to understand the prevailing winds to try to orient the building a certain way, and designing our glazing to take advantage of where we want to and to shield where we want to. So taking that same level of sustainable thinking and applying it into healthcare, but without necessarily labeling it as this program or that program. It is difficult. There's a lot of, like I said, there are a lot of variables when it comes to healthcare. It is generally by regulation and energy hog. There's a lot of energy that's required. There's a lot of environments, let's call it like a surgery, like an OR, a surgery unit, has very strict requirements for humidity and temperature range and things like that. So no matter what you may want to do sustainably, you have an obligation by code and regulation for reasons of safety, patient safety, to provide a certain environment with certain ranges. So you have to get creative on how you start to apply the idea of sustainability. It can absolutely be done. Our firm now is the first, and I believe only firm to ever do a LEED Platinum critical access hospital. And once you get to that level, you're really being creative. We also do a lot of federal work, and there is a requirement for sustainability to be an equivalent of LEED Silver or Gold often. So we definitely see it. It's definitely doable, but sometimes you have to get creative about the strategies you use.
As you grow in your leadership role, you're wearing so many hats, right? Like you said, you're overseeing the business development, you're also overseeing staffing. What does a typical day look for you? I know you do a lot of travel, which is why I really appreciate you making this time. But what does a typical day look for Senior Vice President at Edge of G?
I don't think there is such a thing as a typical day, at least not with my schedule. It does tend to stay very full. I do travel a lot. We're a growing firm. We're what you'd call a medium-sized firm, which is a tough place to be. It's almost easier to be a small firm because you know exactly what you are, or a very large firm because everybody knows what you are. When you're medium, it's harder. You have to, a lot of people do know who you are and what you do, but you really have a foot in both worlds, and it's not as easy to define for yourself sometimes who you are and what you do. So as a growing firm and with responsibilities for business development and other leadership responsibilities, it leads me to go pursue opportunities for exposure to our firm, or just meeting and introducing ourselves to other people, things like that. So that's kind of why I travel a lot. It makes it very difficult to have what I would call a routine or a normal schedule. Scheduling things like a haircut, not that easy, or a doctor's appointment, not that easy. And it's typically that's typically a 5-minute conversation going through 3 or 4 dates, maybe over the span of 5 or 6 weeks until we find one that works. And, sometimes that's difficult. I think a common trait with architects, certainly with me, is that there's a bit of a desire for structure in my life. I like a certain structure and routine. Mm-hmm. And I've had to get used to not being able to have that all the time, and just being able to be flexible and adaptable to what the needs are. Our firm spans 4 states. We have offices in 4 different states. We do projects all over the country, even internationally. And the call to go and visit someone may not even be just for the office I directly manage. It may be more firm-based. So there's a lot of people who have needs, and maybe I can help. So it takes me out of a routine and again, puts me in a situation where I just kind of have to be adaptable to whatever may come up. I try to schedule things ahead as best as I can. I work with our team a lot to communicate my comings and goings, to make sure that we still maintain processes for reviews and seals and things like that, the practical aspect of the job that we do. But it's just, there's a lot of communication there and a lot of back and forth, and a need for understanding on both sides, that I may not be available at a drop of a hat, but that I also need to make myself as available as I can be.
So Dwayne, kind of growing from that again, the fact that HFG is growing, you do have offices across 4 states now, like you mentioned. What are the tools that you adhere to kind of maintain a seamless culture within, say, 4 offices? How do you, is there a shared knowledge base that happens? How do the 4 offices work across to, again, maintain sort of a culture that is HFG still?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And I think it is honestly one of the biggest challenges at any firm, is when you start to have multiple offices, how do you still maintain that common thread of what it means to be someone who works at HFG? Mm-hmm. Or wherever. And that is something that takes constant work. And it's not always perfect. And it is we learn sometimes from what doesn't work as much as we learn from what does work. So certainly I'm not alone in a leadership role. I've got my peers and, our CEO, and we're all very involved and have this conversation a lot. We want to make sure that we are maintaining a consistent culture and consistent expectations, consistent look to our work, et cetera, that things that define us as us. But we also understand that each of the offices may have its own slightly different identity, and that's okay. Because as individuals, we all have a slightly different identity. We all have our own personality. And it would be kind of strange, I think, to expect anything different from an office. So while we are all in a similar region, we're in different states. That gives a little bit of uniqueness to each office. The people that work in those offices live in those states. So they're going to have maybe some background that we don't have. And frankly, I like that. I like the fact that we have a good amount of diversity. I like the fact that people come from different backgrounds. I like to hear what people have to say. People who grew up in totally different environments than I did. They have something to offer that I just didn't live through. I just don't have the ability to have that. So I think that that's part of the fabric of our culture too, is that we want to hear what other people's thoughts are, that we want to understand their background and why they think a certain way. Because if I take their voice and I take my voice and I take your voice and I put it all together, now we have something to talk about. And I think that makes us interesting and good. So while a lot of the aspects of our culture that we need to be consistent and the same have more to do with the look of the architecture, the way the drawings are put together, and some of the standards and processes, that needs to be consistent. The actual personality of each office can be a little bit unique as long as we're all talking to each other. And so we do make an effort to do that. We do work across offices so teams get exposure to each other. It's not just everybody here does their work and everybody in a different office does their work. We do work across teams quite a bit. And I think that that's important For one, it puts the right people in the right position to succeed on a given project based on their actual experience. And for two, I think it gives you good exposure because it's easy. It's terribly easy to feel like it's us and them, even if you're the same firm, because it's us in Tulsa versus them in wherever, Wichita. It's not us and them, it's us and us. Mm-hmm. And it's when you work together, when you actually have a face on the other end of a phone call, a Teams call, or working together, and maybe you go to that office in person to do something, go to a meeting with them. It really makes it a human experience at that point. And that's where we really succeed as an overall culture.
Right. You've grown up, like you started off at Oklahoma. Now you handle 4 states. How have you seen the healthcare design industry evolve and change? Like, what are some of the unique challenges that maybe exist only within the healthcare industry in Oklahoma?
Yeah, I mean, I think each state does have slightly different challenges, but there's many of the same challenges too. And it's not just Oklahoma or the 4 states we work in. The fact of the matter is, across America, healthcare, especially rural healthcare, is having a hard time surviving. Our firm was founded doing rural healthcare, and we've over 30 years grown to do everything healthcare under the sun, from large systems to, small critical access hospitals. But where we really see a lot of pressure is in the rural health market. It's just really hard in an environment where a lot of people are underinsured or uninsured to make ends meet if you're a small hospital in a small town. A lot of the things that actually, from a business perspective, make hospitals money maybe don't work in a small town. Again, I mentioned surgery earlier. Surgery is a great example. Generally speaking, surgery is a place where a hospital can make money. And that's a good thing because there's a lot of aspects of things that happen in a hospital that don't make money, like the emergency department, or if in many hospitals stop doing it, the OBGYN, where they're doing deliveries for babies. Those don't make money, but those are critical aspects of what it means to be a hospital in a small town to give people access to care. So hospitals know from a business perspective that they're going to have things that are successful financially and things that are not successful financially, and they have to balance, right? There's a lot of things hospitals do as a community service that cost the hospital money, so they have to make that up somewhere. So surgery, for instance, is an example where they potentially could make that up, but it's really hard in a rural environment to attract surgeons. It's really hard to pay staff what they need based on today's market, because the dollars just don't make sense. So there are real challenges with access to healthcare in the rural markets, as well as there is in some urban markets where you've heard the term food desert. Mm-hmm. Very similar things happen with healthcare. There are healthcare deserts out there where people just don't have access to care, or people don't have access to care from people that they want to get care from. Right? People who maybe look like them or sound like them. And so it is a real problem out there providing access to care. And I think that a lot of what we do and have done in the past, a lot of our projects have spoken to that, have tried to answer to that. A lot of our background in planning tries to answer that question. Well, can we explore this? Can we explore that? What about this? How can we make this successful? Because many, again, speaking mostly to rural healthcare, which is where I see a lot of the problems right now. You have to find that thing that can make them successful, because a lot of them are in very old facilities that are costing them money. It costs them money because the maintenance cost is very high. It costs them money because the facility operation cost is very high. It's very inefficient old buildings, very inefficient old equipment that's being held together with bubble gum and duct tape. The buildings that they built in the 50s and 60s and even some in the 70s just do not support the way healthcare is provided today.
Right.
So you have all of these factors stacked against you in some of these older facilities, and you need to replace it. You need to replace it. The owner knows they need to replace it. Where's the money coming from? Well, they're not making enough in revenue to pay for a new hospital, so they need community support. And sometimes that works, or they need a loan. And the loan aspect is difficult because your revenue is status quo. I mean, it's not necessarily changing just because you get a new facility. Yes, you could be more efficient, but you have to add something into the revenue stream to be able to secure a loan in most cases. So when that happens, when you're in that situation, you need to look for those opportunities that they may not be doing or taking advantage of now. So that's an aspect of something we look at to kind of help support that. But, again, ultimately, this all goes back to access to care and the lack of access to care for many in our country, because, again, many are underinsured or uninsured. They can't afford it. Our healthcare insurance system is usually through the employer. And I know we now have healthcare.gov. That's a step in the right direction. And many people have Medicare and things like that. But there are still just large gaps out there. And frankly, there's a systemic distrust in certain communities of the system or of the government to receive that assistance. And when you look back through the history, and not to get too deep into it, but when you look back at the history of why that might be, it's actually fairly obvious why that may be. And it just makes the problem more difficult to solve. Really, what we ought to all strive for is providing access to care for everyone, whatever that looks like. And it can look like a lot of different things, but that in the industry is certainly a huge challenge. We saw it with a Native American tribe that we did a project for. Their closest access to healthcare was 2 hours away.
Wow.
Well, if you work an hourly job and you have to take off 2 hours to drive there and then wait for your appointment and then 2 hours to drive back, you've lost an entire day's worth of wages. And if you're living day to day, paycheck to paycheck, you can't afford to do that. Even if you do have insurance, you can't afford to do that. So one project we did through the IHS is to help bring access closer to home and to create an entire new healthcare, essentially, system to plug that particular hole. But that's just one example. There's a lot of those examples. So I think access to care would be my answer as to where I see the biggest problems. I think that there's a lot of aspects to this outside the realm of just architecture that I see just by being involved in this industry.
Mm-hmm. And so, Dwayne, given everything that you just listed, and then again, we see this huge sort of talk about AI and technology coming in. Are there any bits that you are particularly excited about when you see this and the challenges that exist within the industry, and AI providing maybe the solution or aiding some sort of a solution? Or what kind of trend do you see within that space of technology and healthcare design?
Well, it's hard to have very many conversations without talking about AI, and I would not claim to be any sort of expert in this field. But from my position and what I see, and these are not original thoughts, I see AI as a necessary thing that is, maybe let me restate that. I think AI fills a gap that we're seeing in the industry. And I actually just had a conversation with the staff about this. In 2008, 9, 10, the United States had a pretty big economic depression, or recession, really, rather. And we saw a lot of people leave the industry. A lot of people left architecture altogether. And then we had COVID, and we saw even more people leave the industry at that point. And so what we have now is a shortage of people in the industry that are qualified to do the job, and like I said, healthcare is a higher calling. I think it is harder to find people with that level of qualification. And so what's the answer? Well, we're not magically just going to have a whole new cohort of people flood the industry that are qualified to take those open positions. Almost every firm leader that I talk to, and I talk to a lot, and almost every market that I go to, I hear the same things. Can't find enough people. Can't find enough qualified people. They're just not out there. And it's true. They are not out there because they all left the industry 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, 5 years ago. So when you look at how people grow through the industry and the hierarchy of any given firm, you've got people who have just graduated school to people who have been in the industry for 40 or 50 years. and you've got this spectrum of people and you've got gaps, chunk missing here, and you've got a chunk missing here. Well, when I move up into my role, I mean, somebody has to move up into my previous role and somebody has to move up into their role. And at some point, we've just lost that group of people to move up into those roles. And we've had to fill those roles best we can. Now, this gets me back around to your question about AI, because there's certain aspects of AI that I think can help us fill some of those gaps. And the strongest asset I believe an architect has is the ability to think, solve problems in a creative way, not necessarily knowing the answer, but I do believe that a lot of what we do as an industry is try to understand all the details and facts. And even though I do healthcare, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a nurse, but I have to understand how the doctor works and how the nurse works and how the hospital makes money. Well, that's the important thing for me to focus on. There are probably less important factors of the job that AI may be able to automate for me and allow me to spend my time on the thing that's the highest, most valuable thing for me to spend my time on. And that to me is where AI really can help our industry right now, where we're very much struggling to find the right people and the right amount of people to fill the needs and the demand for the work that's out there.
So just the last question, Dwayne. Given you have 18 years of experience at hand, I know for you, healthcare architecture kind of found you. That wasn't by design when you started off. But if somebody were to have the clarity that healthcare architecture is what I want to get into, what is that one piece of advice you would give them that they should be mindful of while they're kind of making their way to it? Now that you
Great question. Yeah. So I've been doing healthcare architecture for the last 18 years, and I've been in the field for total about 21. And I think anybody who goes into the field of architecture really needs to understand that this is a devotion, and you can't halfway do architecture. It can be challenging. It can be a challenging industry. I've not really met many architects who think that as a industry we're compensated for what we're worth, for the amount of school that we go through, for the amount of scrutiny and legal liability that we're under for the work we do. So, most people are probably not getting into it for the money. They're getting into it for the passion. And I've known a lot of people who've gone all the way through school and gotten into the industry only to discover that they don't have that passion. And then they leave the industry, which is frankly probably appropriate for them, but it's just a real shame that they devoted all that time and effort and energy only to decide that they maybe are better suited somewhere else. So the first thing I'd say is, even as an architect, before you even get to healthcare, are you sure this is what you want to do? Do you really know what this means? If you think you want to be an architect, and we participate in a great program through our local AIA here that takes high school students who think they may be interested in architecture, and they shadow us for 2-3 weeks in the office. And they're paid as an intern, and they get exposure to projects. They actually get to work in the programs. They go out on to job site visits, and they go to meetings with us. And we're really trying very hard to give them a real look at what it means. And it's in fact this is tricky because I live in a state that's made it difficult to use the term DEI, but it's essentially a DEI program because there's a lot of people that we want to hear their voices in our industry, and they're not naturally attracted to what is predominantly a white male industry, such as myself. So how do you get those other voices in there? And this is one way we've done this, but it also gives them a real look at what it means to do what we do in high school, so that by the time they're graduating, they know maybe this is something I really want to do. I think that that's huge. And anybody whose child thinks they might want to go into architecture or interior design, I would encourage them to go find someone to shadow. So I would encourage people to go do that. Now, to your actual question, healthcare architecture. This is something that over the years I've learned I have to start asking different questions to interview candidates. I think it sounds great, I actually go back to, let me take us half a step back. I go back to when I interviewed for my job when I first became a healthcare architect. And I was interviewing for the firm. I did not know I was interviewing for the healthcare team.
Okay.
I knew several people at the firm already, and they said, "Hey, we have an opening. Would you care to interview?" Yeah, I'd love to. So I go and interview, and they ask me, "What do you think of healthcare architecture?" And I said, "I've never thought of healthcare architecture," because I've literally never thought of healthcare architecture before that moment. And when a lot of people ask me what I do, and I say I design healthcare, they said, "I didn't know that was a thing." So I think even for architects or for the public at large, they don't really understand that there's maybe this subset of architecture specifically dedicated to healthcare. Now, once they think about it, it makes all the sense in the world for how sensitive it is and how code driven it is and all those things. But a lot of people just haven't thought about it. So I've learned I have to ask different questions when we're interviewing. Are you comfortable being uncomfortable? A lot of what we do comes at you pretty fast. It's a little uncomfortable sometimes. You have to go dig in and learn how to figure out the answer. Maybe a very complicated piece of equipment. You have to go learn how to research that equipment, how to install that equipment, look at old projects, things like that. You have to be a little bit comfortable with the unknown. You know, a lot of people don't understand that healthcare actually has a lot of variety to it. And, you know, there's hospitals, sure, that's what people think of, but there's surgery centers, clinics, behavioral health, senior living, even memory care. You know, there's a lot of aspects of what we do that people don't think of. I also have to make sure that they understand that while design is important, there's a lot of aspects of healthcare that are more important. You have to understand, first and foremost, that in many of our projects, there's an actual patient on the other end of it. That's the most important thing. And that the staff, the nurses, the doctors, and the administrators of any given hospital or healthcare environment, you have to take care of them too, so they can provide the best care to that patient. It's a heavily regulated industry. There's a lot of codes. So not only do we deal with the same codes that someone who designs an office building might deal with, but we deal with enhanced codes on top of that. In FPA, that's a daily code book for us. FGI, that's a daily regulation that we have to look at for every project, every licensed project, which, speaking of, you have to understand the difference between a licensed project through CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, versus a non-licensed project, and how business of healthcare works. So there's a lot of aspects that are not just putting lines on paper, that I like to make sure people are that they understand and that they get exposed to. So I do like to make sure that people understand that there are some differences in this industry, and we're going to look at codes, and we're going to look at the environment itself. Are the materials durable? Will they last? Can they be maintained? Are they cleanable? Have we built an environment that's safe from slips and falls? Have we provided an accessible environment? Have we provided an equitable environment? And then, oh, by the way, it needs to look nice. So a lot of things that a lot of architects graduate school thinking they're going to do versus what we actually do is very different. There are certainly opportunities, ample opportunities to express your design, your design flair or your design capabilities, but it sometimes just looks a little different how it's applied in our industry, because while I think a lot of people traditionally think of design as what it looks like, and I think a lot of awards in our architecture culture emphasize that aspect of architecture. It's a single glossy picture that might, be nice on the cover of a magazine. What we actually do is so much deeper and so much richer, that I think that the planning and the process of how people move through a space and how users experience that space, security, all those things, that's also design. And that is what we're really doing here.
Yeah, thank you. And I would argue, Dwayne, maybe at times a lot more creative. Like you said, like to play out whatever you've been trained as an architect to do and then implement it within the healthcare industry, it just involves you to be so much more creative. And
I think the more restrictions you have, the more creative you have to be.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dwayne. I really, really enjoyed this conversation.
Same to me.